My father left the family business, where I worked for 20 years, to my brother, and gave me only my grandfather's old garage. You know how some people say they found their calling? Well, I thought mine was written in motor oil and V8 rumbles. The smell of gasoline mixed with old leather seats was basically my cologne growing up. My grandfather opened his auto shop back in 1963, right when the first Mustangs were rolling off the line looking like freedom on four wheels. By the time I came around in the early 80s, that place was already legendary in our small Iowa town. I was just a scrawny kid then, running around that garage like it was my personal playground, chasing drop bolts and watching Grandpa work his magic on those beautiful machines. Grandpa had this way of talking to engines like they were old friends. He'd lean over a carburetor, grease up to his elbows, and mutter things like, "Come on, sweetheart, tell me what's wrong." But the thing he told me most, the words that stuck like superglue to my brain, was this: "Rick, an engine is a hard machine and hearts don't lie. They'll tell you exactly what they need if you just listen." Man, I hung on to every word that old guy said like it was gospel from the mount. When Grandpa passed away in '98, it felt like someone ripped the soul right out of that garage. But Dad and we kept that place breathing. We had regulars who'd been coming since the Nixon administration, guys who trusted us with their weekend warriors and daily drivers alike. I honestly believe this was it for me. My destiny was sealed in that concrete floor, under those fluorescent lights that hum like a hymn. But life has this funny way of sucker punching you when you least expect it. Dad remarried when I was 25, brought home this woman named Patricia, who smiled like a politician and dressed like she was heading to some country club board meeting. She had this way of looking at our garage like it was some kind of unfortunate growth she wanted to have surgically removed. Patricia would walk through in her designer shoes, stepping around oil stains like they were landmines, saying things like, "The future is downtown. Rick, not in this garage that smells like the 1970s died here." I tried to laugh it off at first. Patricia obviously didn't understand what we did, didn't get that we weren't just fixing cars. We were keeping American dreams running. Every time she makes some comment about modernizing or moving with the times, I just remind myself that Dad loved this place as much as Grandpa and I did. This was our family legacy, our piece of the American dream, built one wrench turn at a time. Dad started changing, though. Slowly at first, like rust creeping across chrome. He'd spend less time in the garage, more time in meetings Patricia set up with business consultants and development specialists. These people would show up in suits that cost more than most of our customers' cars, talking about maximizing property value and urban renewal opportunities. I kept telling myself Dad was just exploring options, that he'd never actually sell the place that Grandpa built with his own two hands. The garage itself was nothing fancy, just a concrete block building with bay doors that had seen better decades, and a sign that Grandpa hand-painted back when Eisenhower was president. But inside those walls lived 40 years of automotive history. Every tool had a story. Every workbench had memories ground into the wood grain like ancient prayers. I remember one particular evening. Patricia was holding court at the dinner table, going on about some development project downtown. She pointed her fork at me like it was a weapon and said, "Rick, your garage is like a Lynyrd Skynyrd album. Nostalgic for some people, but completely outdated and taking up valuable space." Dad just sat there, not saying a word, cutting his pot roast like nothing happened. That's when I should have seen the writing on the wall. Should have realized that the man who taught me how to rebuild a transmission was already gone. When Dad died suddenly of a heart attack last spring, I was devastated. But somewhere between the grief and the shock, I found myself thinking that maybe now I could finally run the family business the way Grandpa would have wanted. I had plans, big ones. I was going to restore that place to its former glory, maybe even expand into classic car restoration. The American muscle car scene was having a renaissance, and I had all of Grandpa's old knowledge locked away in my head like a vault full of automotive gold. Then came the will reading. I sat in that lawyer's office expecting to hear about my inheritance, about taking over the family legacy. Instead, I got blindsided harder than a deer on Interstate 80. Turns out Patricia had convinced Dad to change everything. Travis, my stepbrother who couldn't tell a spark plug from a dinner roll, got the main shop All the equipment, the customer database, even the business name. This guy who'd never turned a wrench in his life, who thought carburetors were some kind of pasta dish, was now the proud owner of Ed's Auto Service. And me? I got Grandpa's old garage out on the edge of town, and a few boxes of what Travis called junk. The lawyer read it like he was announcing a grocery list, completely oblivious of the fact that he was basically watching a man's entire identity get flushed down the drain. I just sat there, numb, while Patricia smiled that politician's smile, and Travis looked like he'd just won the lottery without buying a ticket. Travis had the nerve to pat my shoulder on the way out, saying something about how I could always get a job at Jiffy Lube if I needed work. That's when I realized this wasn't just about money or property. This was about erasing everything Grandpa Ed had built, everything Dad and I had maintained. They were turning our family's automotive cathedral into just another business transaction. So there I was, 39 years old, packing up my entire life into garbage bags and cardboard boxes. See, I've been living in the 2 rooms above the main shop for the past 15 years. Nothing fancy, just a bedroom and a kitchenette that Dad had converted back in the day. It was convenient, cheap, and meant I could roll out of bed and be at work in 30 seconds. Problem was, those rooms were technically part of the main building, which meant they went to Travis along with everything else. So while my stepbrother was probably already planning to convert my home into storage space, I was loading my tools into a beat-up Ford pickup and heading out to what everyone considered the worthless part of my inheritance. Grandpa's original garage sat on 2 acres at the edge of Iowa farmland, surrounded by cornfields that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. The building itself was older than disco, with wooden doors that creaked like an old rocking chair and windows that had seen more weather than a TV meteorologist. I dragged an old travel trailer out there and parked it behind the garage like some kind of automotive hermit. The first night, lying on that lumpy mattress and listening to the corn rustling in the wind, I felt like I'd hit rock bottom harder than a dropped transmission. The place smelled like motor oil, old dreams, and about 40 years of Midwest weather. But you know what? It also smelled like home. The next morning, I started going through those boxes Patricia and Travis had written off as worthless junk. What I found was basically an automotive archaeologist's dream. Grandpa had saved everything. Original blueprints, yellowed Sears catalogs from the 1960s, photographs from local drag strips where he'd posed next to some beautiful Pontiac GTO with a grin wider than the Mississippi. There were hand-drawn schematics for custom parts, notes about modifications he'd made for specific customers, even old racing programs from when he'd sponsored local drivers. One particular photograph stopped me cold. It was from 1965, showing Grandpa at some small-town drag strip, leaning against a cherry red GTO that looked like it could outrun sunlight. He was young then, maybe 30, with grease under his fingernails and pure joy written across his face. On the back, in his distinctive handwriting, he'd written, "Some folks collect stamps. I collect horsepower and memories." I held that picture for probably 20 minutes, just staring at it and remembering all the stories he used to tell about the golden age of American muscle, when cars had personality and engines had souls, about the customers who became friends, the projects that became legends, the simple satisfaction of taking something broken and making it sing again. That's when Patricia's words came flooding back, hitting me like a cold slap across the face. Your garage is like a Lynyrd Skynyrd album, nostalgic for some people, but completely outdated and taking up valuable space. The woman who'd never changed her own oil, who probably thought horsepower was some kind of equestrian term, had dismissed our entire legacy like it was yesterday's newspaper. But then I remembered something else. Something Grandpa used to say when I get frustrated with a particularly stubborn bolt or an engine that wouldn't cooperate. He'd put his hand on my shoulder, look me straight in the eye, and say, "Rick, every nut has its thread, every bolt has its home. Sometimes you just got to keep trying different approaches until you find the one that fits. Don't give up on something just because it doesn't work the first way you tried." Sitting there in that old garage, surrounded by boxes of automotive history, and feeling like a 40-year-old failure, I started thinking about what Grandpa really meant. Maybe he wasn't just talking about mechanical problems. Maybe he was talking about life, about finding your place in a world that seems determined to leave you behind. I spent the next few days cataloging everything in those boxes, like some kind of obsessive automotive librarian. There were blueprints for carburetors that hadn't been manufactured since the Carter administration, detailed drawings of custom intake manifolds, even specifications for handmade gear shifters that Grandpa had created for specific customers back in the day. This stuff wasn't junk. It was a master craftsman's lifetime of accumulated knowledge. The more I looked through everything, the more I realized that Travis and Patricia had made a huge mistake. They got the building, the tools, the customer list, all the obvious valuable stuff, but they completely missed the real treasure. All of Grandpa's innovation, his custom designs, his solutions to problems that modern shops just replace with generic parts. That knowledge was sitting right here in these worthless boxes. I started feeling something I hadn't felt since Dad died. Hope, not the kind of hope you get from buying a lottery ticket, but the real deal, the kind that comes from realizing you've got something valuable that nobody else recognizes yet. Like finding a genuine Shelby Cobra in some farmer's barn, covered in dust, but still perfect underneath. That's when I got this crazy idea. These blueprints, these custom designs, they were like automotive DNA from the golden age of American muscle. There had to be other people out there, car enthusiasts and restorers, who needed exactly this kind of specialized knowledge. People who were trying to bring classic cars back to life, but couldn't find the right parts anywhere. I thought about all those Facebook groups I'd seen, places where classic car guys gather to share stories and ask for help. Groups with names like Classic Car Restorers Midwest and American Muscle Legends. These were people who understood that a 1964 carburetor wasn't just a fuel delivery system. It was a piece of American automotive history that deserved to be preserved. So I did something that probably looked completely insane to anyone watching. I took out my phone, an old iPhone that was almost as outdated as Patricia thought our garage was, and started photographing Grandpa's blueprints. The paper was yellowed and fragile, some of it torn at the edges, but every line was still clear, every measurement still precise. These drawings represented hundreds of hours of careful thought and experimentation, solutions to problems that most people didn't even know existed. My hands were shaking a little as I uploaded the first photo to the Classic Car Restorers Midwest Facebook group. It was a detailed schematic for a custom carburetor setup that Grandpa had designed for a 1964 Ford Galaxy. The kind of part that you literally couldn't buy anywhere anymore. The kind of thing that would make a serious restorer weep with joy. I stared at that post for probably 10 minutes before I could work up the courage to add a caption. Finally, I typed, "Found this 1964 carburetor blueprint in my grandfather's garage. Does anyone need custom parts like this anymore? Trying to figure out if this stuff has any value." Then I hesitated and added, "Serious inquiries only. This is 60 years of automotive knowledge we're talking about." My finger hovered over the post button like it was a trigger on some kind of social media nuclear weapon. This felt like such a huge gamble. Putting Grandpa's life work out there for the world to judge, admitting that I was basically at the end of my rope, and hoping strangers on the internet might care about some old automotive blueprints. But you know what? Sometimes when you're down to your last quarter, you might as well put in the slot machine and see what happens. At least that way you're doing something, instead of just sitting there feeling sorry for yourself. I thought about what Grandpa would say if he could see me now, probably something about how every nut has its thread, and maybe it was time to find mine. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer to the automotive gods, and hit post. Then I sat back in that creaky old chair, listening to corn rustle outside and my heart pound like a V8 engine at idle, waiting to see if anyone in the world cared about the legacy of a small-town mechanic who'd been gone for over 20 years. The post went live at exactly 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in May. I know because I screenshot it, like it was some kind of historic moment. Maybe it was, or maybe I was just a desperate guy in a trailer, throwing automotive Hail Marys into the digital darkness and hoping someone would catch one. Either way, there was no going back now. Grandpa's blueprints were out there in the world, and all I could do was wait to see if anybody still cared about the kind of craftsmanship that built America's automotive golden age. The notification light on my phone blinked once, then went quiet. I woke up at 6 in the morning to my old iPhone buzzing like a V8 engine at idle. 23 notifications from that Facebook group were waiting for me, and my heart started doing things it hadn't done since high school. I sat there in my trailer, sipping warm Coca-Cola from a can I'd opened the night before, squinting at the screen like I was reading winning lottery numbers. The first message was from some guy in Wisconsin named Dale, who wrote that he'd been looking for that exact carburetor blueprint for his 1964 Galaxy restoration. He wanted to know if I'd sell him a copy, and would I happen to have any other Ford blueprints from that era. The second message was from a woman in Oregon asking about intake manifold designs. The third was from a kid in Minnesota who said his grandfather would have cried happy tears to see that kind of craftsmanship. I sat there in my underwear and yesterday's t-shirt, reading message after message from people who actually understood what they were looking at. These weren't just casual car enthusiasts. These were serious restorers, people who knew the difference between a Holley and a Carter carburetor, folks who could spot an original part from 50 yards away. And they were all excited about Grandpa's old blueprints. Maybe Grandpa was right about that whole thread thing after all. Maybe I'd been trying to force the wrong bolt into the wrong hole my entire life, and this was finally the right match. I grabbed a pen and started writing down names and what each person wanted, feeling like some kind of automotive stockbroker taking orders for vintage dreams. By 8 o'clock, I'd counted 17 serious inquiries and 3 people offering to buy whatever other blueprints I might have. My hands were shaking a little, not from the caffeine, but from the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely screwed after all. But first, I needed to figure out how to turn these old paper drawings into something people could actually use. I threw on some clean clothes and drove into town to Kinko's, which was the only place within 50 miles that had a decent scanner. The girl working there couldn't have been more than 19, with pink hair and enough piercings to set off a metal detector. She looked at Grandpa's blueprints like I'd brought in some kind of ancient artifact. "Is this like instructions for a time machine or something?" she asked, handling the yellowed paper like it might crumble into dust. I couldn't help but laugh. In a way, she wasn't wrong. These blueprints were basically time machines, ways to bring 1960s automotive engineering back to life in 2023. I spent the next 2 hours carefully scanning every blueprint I had, making sure the resolution was high enough to read every measurement and notation. Grandpa's handwriting was precise and neat, like he knew someday these drawings would be important to someone. Each page cost me $3 a scan, but watching those faded pencil lines transform into crisp digital images felt like watching the past shake hands with the future. The first person I sent files to was Dale from Wisconsin. He transferred $60 through PayPal faster than I could blink, and sent me a message saying he'd been searching for those exact specifications for 2 years. 2 years. This guy had been hunting for something that was sitting in my junk boxes the whole time, gathering dust while I felt sorry for myself. But the real game changer came from an unexpected source. A kid named Matt from some community college in Illinois saw my post and sent me a message that made my brain do a complete 180. He said he was studying automotive technology and had access to CAD software and 3D printers. If I could send him the blueprints, he could convert them to modern digital formats and actually print prototype parts. I remembered something Grandpa used to say when he'd see new technology. The future isn't about replacing the old ways, Rick. It's about making the old ways work better. He'd said that back in the 90s when computerized diagnostics started showing up in shops, and everyone was worried that computers would replace good old-fashioned mechanical knowledge. Matt and I started exchanging messages, and within a week, he'd turned one of Grandpa's gear shifter designs into a CAD file and printed a prototype. When he sent me photos of that first part, a custom shift knob for a Ford Falcon with an engraved logo, I stared at it for probably 20 minutes. It was like holding an Oscar, except this was better because it represented something real, something useful. That shift knob was perfect. Every curve, every dimension, every detail exactly as Grandpa had drawn it 60 years ago. But now it was made from modern materials that would last longer and look better than anything from back then. Matt had somehow managed to honor the past while embracing the future, which is exactly what Grandpa would have wanted. I decided to test the waters and open an Etsy shop Naming it took me about 3 hours and half a case of beer, but I finally settled on Midwest Gear Tickler, partly because it sounded like something from the 70s, and partly because I have the sense of humor of a 12-year-old boy. Matt agreed to 3D print the parts for a percentage of each sale. So the first item I listed was a reproduction Chevrolet badge based on one of Grandpa's designs. Price at $60. It sold within 4 hours. $60 for something that started as a pencil drawing in a dusty box. I felt like that kid who found the first dollar bill he ever earned washing cars at 14. Except this time I was pushing 40 and living in a trailer behind a garage that time forgot. The buyer left a review saying it was exactly what he needed for his Camaro restoration, and that the quality was better than anything he could find from the big part suppliers. Reading that review was like getting a personal letter from Grandpa himself, telling me I was finally on the right track. Word started spreading through the classic car community, faster than gossip, in a small town. The HMB Forum, that's a ham for people who don't know classic car culture, picked up my story, and suddenly I was getting messages from people I'd never heard of asking about parts for cars I'd only seen in museums. One of those messages came from a guy named Joe in Kansas who introduced himself as a foundry worker specializing in small batch metal casting. He'd seen my Etsy shop and wanted to know if I'd be interested in partnering up to produce actual metal parts based on Grandpa's designs. His message ended with, "I can make anything you can draw, but you buy the beer when we meet." Joe turned out to be exactly the kind of guy you'd expect to find in a Kansas foundry, gruff, straightforward, and absolutely brilliant at his craft. We started with simple stuff: door handles, trim pieces, small brackets that you couldn't buy anywhere else anymore. Joe would cast them, I'd finish and ship them, and we'd split the profits down the middle. The business grew organically, like a well-tuned engine finding its rhythm. Orders started coming in for custom valve covers, intake manifold badges, even personalized ship plates for Dodge Chargers and Plymouth Cudas. Each piece was based on Grandpa's original designs, but customized for specific customers who wanted something unique for their restoration projects. I was making more money in a month than I'd made in 6 months at the family shop, and I was doing from a trailer in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia had always said the future was downtown, in some glass office building, but here I was proving that the future could be anywhere you had passion and an internet connection. Matt kept improving his 3D printing setup and started offering rapid prototyping services. If someone wanted to see what a part would look like before committing to a metal casting, Matt could have a plastic version ready in a couple of days. We were like some kind of distributed manufacturing network, connected by our shared love of automotive history and modern technology. The best part was the stories that came with each order. People would tell me about the cars they were restoring: their father's old Mustang, their grandfather's Thunderbird, the Corvette they'd bought in high school, and finally had time to fix up after retirement. Every part we made was helping someone preserve a piece of automotive history, keeping these classic machines running for another generation. I started to understand what Grandpa meant about engines being hearts. These cars weren't just transportation. They were repositories of memory, connections to times and people that mattered. When someone bought a custom shift knob for their dad's old Camaro, they weren't just buying a part. They were buying a piece of their own history back. By November, I had a waiting list 3 weeks long and was seriously considering hiring help. The trailer was getting crowded with inventory, shipping supplies, and all the equipment needed to run a modern manufacturing business from what used to be the middle of nowhere. My neighbor's corn had been harvested, leaving nothing but stubble and sky as far as you could see. But somehow that emptiness felt like possibility instead of isolation. I was packaging an order for a custom Plymouth badge when my phone buzzed with a new message. This one was different from the usual inquiries. It came through Facebook Messenger instead of the business channels I'd set up, and the profile picture caught my attention immediately. It was a woman standing next to a 1967 Mustang that looked like it had stepped out of a time machine. The car was primer gray and clearly in the middle of a restoration, but you could see the potential underneath all that prep work. Her smile reminded me of those old Coca-Cola commercials from the 80s, genuine and warm, like she was sharing a secret joke with whoever was taking the picture. The message was short but hit different than all the others. "Hi, Rick. I'm restoring a '67 Mustang that belonged to my dad. wondering if you could make a custom shift knob with his initials. This car means everything to me, and I want every detail to be perfect. Let me know if this is something you could help with. Thanks, May Garner, Austin, Texas. I clicked on her profile and spent way too much time looking through her photos. There were pictures of her working on the Mustang, hands dirty, hair tied back, completely focused on bringing that car back to life. Other photos showed her at car shows, always with that same genuine smile, talking to other enthusiasts like they were old friends. This wasn't someone who just owned a classic car. This was someone who understood what these machines meant. Something about her message felt different from all the others. Maybe it was the way she mentioned her dad, or the fact that she said the car meant everything to her. Or maybe it was just that smile in her profile picture that made me think about things I hadn't thought about in a long time. Like what it might be like to share this automotive obsession with someone who actually got it. I found myself staring at that message for a lot longer than I probably should have. Here I was, 39 years old, living in a trailer behind a garage, and getting butterflies over a Facebook message from a woman in Texas I'd never met. But there was something about the way she wrote, something about the respect she had for her father's memory and the care she was putting into that restoration. I started typing a response 3 different times before I finally settled on something that didn't make me sound like a complete amateur. But even as I was writing about shift knobs and custom engraving, I couldn't shake the feeling that this message was going to change things in ways I hadn't expected. Maybe Grandpa was right about more than just finding the right thread for every bolt. Maybe some connections are just meant to happen when the timing is right, when you're finally ready to see what's been there all along. And maybe sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places, like old blueprints in dusty boxes, or messages from strangers who understand what it means to keep automotive dreams alive. My phone was still showing her message on the screen, that Mustang gleaming in the Texas sunshine behind her smile. Whatever happened next, I had the feeling this was going to be more than just another custom order. This felt like the beginning of something I hadn't even known I was looking for. May Garner's follow-up message hit me like a perfectly tuned carburetor. Smooth, powerful, and exactly what I needed to hear. She explained that her Mustang wasn't just another restoration project. It was summer of 1989, her dad teaching her to drive stick shift in an empty Walmart parking lot, while Creedence Clearwater Revival played on the radio. She wrote about how he'd let her shift gears while he worked the clutch, both of them laughing when she'd grind the transmission. I understood her immediately. Grandpa always said that cars weren't just machines. They were memory keepers, rolling repositories of the moments that mattered most. When May described her dad's hands guiding hers on that same shifter, I could practically hear Grandpa's voice saying, "Rick, a car is just metal and rubber until someone loves it. Then it becomes immortal." I wrote her back that same night, promising to make something special for her dad's memory. But instead of just agreeing to a basic custom job, I decided to do something that would have made Grandpa proud. I spent 3 days working with Matt to design a shift knob that incorporated her father's initials in a way that looked like original Ford script, then added a small engraving of a Mustang silhouette on the top. When the final piece came back from Matt's printer, it was perfect. Classic enough to belong in a '67 Mustang, but personal enough to carry the weight of all those memories. But I wasn't done yet. I dug through Grandpa's boxes until I found what I was looking for. An original pencil sketch of a 1967 Mustang fastback, complete with racing stripes and mag wheels. I carefully placed that sketch in the shipping box along with the shift knob and wrote a note on the back. "For your dad. Keep the memories rolling. Rick and Grandpa Ed." It felt like the right thing to do, like Grandpa would have wanted his drawings to be part of someone else's restoration story. May called me 3 days later, and I could hear the emotion in her voice before she even said hello. She thanked me for the sketch, said it looked exactly like the car her dad always dreamed of building. Then she laughed and asked if I was some kind of garage poet, sending automotive artwork to strangers in Texas. That phone call lasted 2 hours. We talked about everything. Her marketing job in Austin, my disaster and inheritance, the way classic cars seem to connect people across generations, and geography. May had this laugh that reminded me of summer evenings and drive-in movies. And when she described working on her Mustang, you could hear the passion in every word. She mentioned that my Etsy shop looked like it was run by someone who understood cars, but maybe didn't understand business. My product photos looked like they were taken with a potato, and my packaging was whatever boxes I could find behind the grocery store. She wasn't wrong. I'd been so focused on making good parts that I completely ignored making them look professional. May offered to help redesign my online presence. She said my shop name, Midwest Gear Tickler, sounded like classic rock from the 70s, which was perfect, but everything else looked like I was selling parts out of a flea market booth. She volunteered to create a proper logo, clean up my product descriptions, and maybe even build a real website to replace my cobbled-together Etsy setup. I should have been embarrassed, but instead I was grateful. Here was someone who understood both the automotive world and the business world, offering to help a guy she'd never met just because she believed in what I was doing. It felt like finding a $20 bill in an old jacket pocket. Unexpected and exactly what you needed. Working with May was like discovering my business had been running on 3 cylinders and suddenly firing on all 8. She created a logo that looked like something Ford might have used in the 60s, redesigned my product photos to show the craftsmanship in detail, and helped me transition from Etsy to a proper Shopify website that actually looked professional. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Orders started coming in from places I'd never shipped to before: Texas, Oregon, even Alaska. I joked with May that pretty soon I'd be shipping to Canada and would need to buy myself a maple leaf baseball cap. She laughed and said she'd already had customers asking if we shipped internationally. Our phone calls became a regular thing, usually starting with business talk and evolving into something deeper. May would call it Garage Netflix. Our nightly conversations about everything from carburetor theory to life philosophy. We'd talk for hours about restoration projects, about the difference between original and reproduction parts, about why some car guys could spot a fake chrome trim piece from 50 yards away. I shared stories about Grandpa, about the betrayal with Travis and Patricia, about living in a trailer, and wondering if I completely screwed up my life. May had this way of listening that made you feel heard without being judged, like she understood that sometimes life doesn't follow the blueprint you drew up when you were 20. One conversation stands out. It was late on a Wednesday night, and we'd been talking for 3 hours about everything except business. May asked what I missed most about the old family shop, and I found myself telling her about Saturday mornings when I was a kid. Grandpa would let me help by handing him tools and sorting bolts, and he'd tell stories about the cars he'd worked on, the races he'd attended, the dreams people brought to his garage. May went quiet for a minute, then shared her own version of that same feeling. She talked about summer evenings when her dad would work on various projects in their garage, and she'd sit on an old milk crate, watching him rebuild carburetors or adjust valve timing. Those conversations while he worked taught her more about life than any classroom ever could. By March, our business partnership had evolved into something neither of us had planned, but both of us needed. May would handle marketing and customer service from Austin, while I focused on production and fulfillment from Iowa. We were like a distributed automotive restoration company, connected by shared passion and a phone line that got more use than an interstate highway. That's when May suggested something that terrified and excited me in equal measure. She wanted to drive up to Iowa for the annual Midwest Classic Car Festival. She said it would be good for business to meet customers face-to-face, and besides, she'd never seen cornfields that went to the horizon in every direction. I spent a week cleaning up the garage and trailer, like I was expecting a visit from the Queen of England. May arrived on a Friday afternoon in early May, driving her half-restored Mustang, like she was delivering hope on 4 wheels. When she stepped out of that car, wearing jeans and a vintage Ford racing t-shirt, I realized that all our phone conversations hadn't prepared me for the reality of meeting someone who could make automotive enthusiasm look effortless. The festival was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. We set up a booth displaying some of our custom parts, and May's marketing skills turned our little display into a magnet for serious collectors. She had this way of talking to customers that made them feel like they were joining an exclusive club rather than just buying car parts. What made the weekend even better was watching May experience Midwest car culture for the first time. She'd grown up around Texas car shows, but there was something different about Iowa enthusiasts. Maybe it was the way they treated every car like a neighbor's prized possession, or how they'd spend 20 minutes discussing the correct shade of blue for a 1969 Camaro interior. Saturday afternoon, I was explaining the difference between Grandpa's carburetor designs and modern reproductions to a customer when I noticed May deep in conversation with a guy who had professional camera equipment hanging around his neck. He looked familiar, but it took me a minute to place him. Derek from Vice Grip Garage, a YouTube channel I'd been watching for years. Derek specialized in finding unusual automotive stories and turned them into episodes that somehow made car restoration feel accessible to everyone. I'd seen him feature everything from barn-find Corvettes to backyard mechanics, building race cars out of junkyard parts. Watching him talk to May, I had this sinking feeling that we were about to become someone else's automotive entertainment. When the customer left, May waved me over with this excited expression that usually meant she discovered some new business opportunity. Derek introduced himself and explained that he'd been at the festival looking for content when multiple people had mentioned our booth and our story about turning grandfather's blueprints into a modern business. Saturday night, the festival organizer set up a DJ playing music from the 50s and 60s, and people started dancing between the rows of classic cars. May grabbed my hand when Unchained Melody started playing, pulling me into an impromptu slow dance right there next to her Mustang. I felt like I was starring in some classic American movie, except instead of being a handsome leading man, I was a guy in work boots and a shirt that still smelled faintly of motor oil. But May didn't seem to care about any of that. She looked at me like I was exactly where I belonged, like this moment had been inevitable from the first message she'd sent about her father's car. Dancing under those festival lights, surrounded by hundreds of automotive dreams made manifest, I understood something Grandpa had tried to teach me years earlier. He'd said that the best things in life happen when you stop trying to force the wrong pieces together and start paying attention to the connections that feel natural. May and I fit together like a perfectly matched gear set, different strengths, complementary skills, but somehow creating something stronger than either of us could manage alone. When the song ended, we just stood there looking at each other, both of us knowing that something had shifted, but neither wanted to put into words quite yet. Sunday morning, Derek found us at our booth and pitched his idea. Vice Grip Garage wanted to feature our operation in an upcoming episode. They were interested in the human story, the betrayal, the inheritance, the way old blueprints had become a modern business, and especially the partnership between a guy in Iowa and a woman in Texas who built something meaningful together. May was immediately excited about the exposure potential, talking about how YouTube could reach customers we'd never find otherwise. She saw the business opportunity, the chance to scale our operation beyond what we'd imagined possible. But I was terrified. I'd spent my entire adult life working in the background, fixing things that other people drove away in. The idea of being on camera, talking about my life and failures for thousands of people to see, felt about as appealing as rebuilding a transmission blindfolded. Derek explained that they weren't looking for polished presentations or sales pitches. Vice Grip Garage was built on authentic stories about real people doing interesting things with cars. He wanted to show the garage, interview us about our process, maybe film us actually making some custom parts. The episode would be called From Blueprints to Business, How Grandpa's Garage Came Back to Life. I looked at May, who was practically vibrating with excitement about the opportunity. Then I thought about Grandpa, about all those stories he'd told me over the years, about the dreams he'd built with his own hands in a garage that most people would have written off as worthless. Maybe it was time to tell his story to a bigger audience, to show people that sometimes the most valuable things are hiding in plain sight. May had already started talking logistics with Derek, discussing filming schedules and what kind of equipment access they'd need. She mentioned that she could extend her Iowa trip by a few days if we decided to move forward with the filming. The way she said it, like staying longer was something she wanted to do anyway, made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with stage fright. Derek mentioned that Vice Grip Garage episodes routinely got hundreds of thousands of views, and that successful features often led to dramatic increases in business for the people involved. The potential was enormous, but so was the risk of looking like a complete amateur on the internet. I thought about what Grandpa would do in this situation. He'd probably tell me that fear is just another kind of bolt that doesn't want to turn, and the solution is usually to try a different approach rather than giving up entirely. He'd remind me that every great story starts with someone being willing to take a chance on something that seems impossible. Standing there in that festival parking lot, watching May's excitement and thinking about all the customers who'd found us through word of mouth, I realized that this YouTube opportunity was exactly the kind of thread Grandpa had been talking about. Maybe this was our chance to reach people who were sitting in their own garages, surrounded by their own boxes of forgotten dreams, wondering if anyone still cared about the things they loved. Derek handed me his business card and said they could film whenever we were ready, probably within the next week, if May was planning to stay longer anyway. He walked away, leaving May and me standing next to her Mustang, holding a piece of paper that might represent our future or our complete humiliation on the internet. May turned to me with that smile that had been haunting my thoughts since her first message and asked if I was ready to become a YouTube star. I looked at her, then at the business card, then back at her, and realized that sometime over the past few months, my definition of scary had completely changed. 6 months ago, I was terrified of losing everything I thought I wanted. Now I was terrified of not pursuing everything I never knew I needed. That night, sitting in my trailer with May drinking beer and planning what we'd say on camera, I felt like we were on the edge of something bigger than either of us had imagined when she first messaged about a custom shift knob. The YouTube opportunity felt like another one of those moments where the right thread finally found the right bolt, where everything clicked into place like it was always meant to happen. May looked at me across the small table and said this could change everything for us. The way she said us made it clear she wasn't just talking about business anymore, and neither was I. Derek and his crew spent Monday and Tuesday filming everything. Me explaining Grandpa's blueprints, May talking about the business side, shots of the garage, the trailer, even Matt's 3D printing setup back in Illinois. Derek made the whole process feel natural, like we were just having conversations about cars instead of being interviewed for YouTube. The Vice Grip Garage video dropped 2 weeks later on a Tuesday morning, and by the following Tuesday, it had racked up over 500,000 views. I woke up to my phone buzzing like an angry wasp, notifications pouring in faster than I could read them. The comments section looked like a classic car enthusiast convention had exploded. People writing things like, "This is what happens when Grandpa's garage comes back to life," and "Where's your website? Take my money already." Our Shopify site crashed harder than a blown engine on the interstate. May was laughing so hard she could barely speak when she called me that morning, saying we were officially trending on YouTube and I was now cooler than cat videos. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or if the bar for internet fame had gotten really low. Derek had done exactly what he'd promised. He'd told our story without making it feel fake or overly polished. The episode showed me in my natural habitat, explaining Grandpa's blueprints while covered in grease, and looking like I'd been wrestling with carburetors all morning. May came across as the business brain who could make vintage car parts sound like the hottest thing since sliced bread. The best part was watching the comment section fill up with stories from other people who'd found automotive treasures in their own family's garages. Apparently, half of America had grandfathers who'd left behind boxes of car-related stuff that everyone thought was worthless junk. Our little Iowa operation had somehow become a symbol of not giving up on the things previous generations had valued. By the end of that first week, we had over 900 orders backed up in our system. I was running around that old garage like a caffeinated squirrel, trying to coordinate with Matt for 3D printing, Joe for metal casting, and about 6 new suppliers I'd had to find just to keep up with demand. The trailer that had seemed spacious enough for a simple operation was now bursting with inventory, shipping materials, and the general chaos of a business that had outgrown its space overnight. I ended up renting a proper warehouse space about 20 minutes from the garage. Nothing fancy, but big enough to actually organize our operation like a real business. When I signed that lease, I felt like I was finally admitting to myself that this thing was bigger than just a hobby that paid the bills. The first person I hired was Tommy, a local guy who'd been laid off in the John Deere plant and knew his way around both traditional machining and modern manufacturing equipment. When he showed up for his first day and saw the scope of what we were doing, he just shook his head and said he thought I was just some dude with a box of old bolts, not someone building an entire automotive parts empire. The second hire was Sarah, fresh out of Iowa State with a logistics degree and enough organizational skills to make a military quartermaster jealous. She took one look at my system of Post-it notes and cardboard boxes and immediately started implementing actual inventory management software. Within a week, she had us running like a real company instead of a very enthusiastic garage sale. What really blew my mind was when Summit Racing reached out. Summit Racing, the catalog that every car guy in America had thumbed through at least once, dreaming about performance parts they couldn't afford. They wanted to carry a line of our reproduction parts in their stores and online catalog. I spent about an hour staring at that email, wondering if someone was playing an elaborate prank on me. 6 months earlier, I'd been living above a garage, getting my inheritance stolen by my stepbrother. Now Summit Racing wanted to put our parts in the same catalog that had been the holy grail of automotive shopping since before I was born. We started developing a whole line of specialty reproductions based on Grandpa's designs. AMC emblems that hadn't been available anywhere for decades, radiator caps from the 1950s that collectors had been hunting for years, custom nameplates for Pontiac muscle cars that looked like they'd rolled off the original assembly line. Each piece was based on Grandpa's meticulous drawings, but manufactured with modern techniques that made them more durable than the originals. The Summit Racing partnership opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Suddenly, we were getting calls from restoration shops across the country, asking if we could reproduce specific trim pieces or badges for customer builds. Classic car dealerships started referring customers to us when they needed parts that simply didn't exist anywhere else. May moved her entire operation to Iowa by the end of August. She kept her Austin apartment initially, saying she wanted to make sure this was really working before burning all her bridges in Texas. But when she showed up with a U-Haul trailer full of her stuff and that same Mustang that had started our whole partnership, I knew she was committed to making this work long-term. The local radio station wanted to do an interview about our entrepreneurial success story, which made me feel like I was being treated as some kind of business guru instead of a guy who'd stumbled into something good through a combination of luck and desperation. During the interview, I tried to explain what we were really doing, keeping automotive history alive, honoring the craftsmanship of previous generations. I told the radio host that Grandpa always said a car without soul was just expensive metal, and what we were doing was giving people ways to put that soul back into their restorations. May was sitting across from me in the studio, and when I said that, she whispered that I was stealing her marketing slogans. But she was smiling when she said it, and I realized that somewhere along the way, we'd become a real team. The radio interview led to calls from newspapers, automotive magazines, and even a few TV stations that wanted to do follow-up stories on a YouTube garage that became a business empire. Empire seemed like a strong word for what was still basically a sophisticated parts-making operation, but I wasn't going to argue with free publicity. That's when Travis decided to make his grand reappearance. He showed up at our new warehouse on a Thursday afternoon, driving a Lexus that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. He walked through our operation like he was conducting some kind of imperial inspection, taking note of our equipment, our inventory, our employees. When he finally got around to talking to me, his proposition was exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd inherited a business he'd never worked for. He wanted to buy in for 50% ownership, claiming he could provide the capital and business connections we'd need to really scale this operation properly. I looked at this guy who'd never turned a wrench in his life, who'd gotten everything handed to him by convincing our father to change his will, and who was now trying to buy his way into something he'd had no part in building. The irony was so thick, you could have cut it with a plasma torch. I told Travis that he'd sold Grandpa's dream for the price of a luxury car and a downtown office space, and I wasn't about to sell even a single bolt of what we'd built from the ashes of that betrayal. May, who'd been watching this whole exchange with the expression of someone watching a particularly entertaining train wreck, suggested that Travis might be better suited to making TikTok videos about his business wisdom. Travis left with his tail between his legs, but not before making some vague threats about lawyers and intellectual property rights. I wasn't too worried. Everything we were doing was based on Grandpa's designs, which had been left to me fair and square. Plus, Travis had demonstrated a remarkable ability to ignore anything that didn't immediately generate profit, so I doubted he'd follow through on legal action that would cost more than it could possibly recover. The whole encounter left me feeling vindicated, but also a little sad. Travis and I had grown up in the same house, but we'd somehow become completely different people. He saw dollar signs where I saw legacy, transactions where I saw relationships. Maybe that's what happened when you inherited everything without earning any of it. By October, we were generating enough revenue to start thinking about our next big move. The warehouse lease was up for renewal, but instead of renewing, May and I started looking at properties where we could build something permanent. Not just a business facility, but a place where we could put down real roots. We found 40 acres about 30 minutes outside of town, with enough space for a proper manufacturing facility, office space, and room to build a house. The land came with an old farmhouse that needed work, but had good bones, just like everything else we'd been restoring. Standing on that property, looking across fields that stretched the horizon, I could picture exactly what Grandpa would have said about it. The purchase process took longer than expected, mainly because I kept having to explain to the bank that yes, we really did make custom car parts based on 60-year-old blueprints. And no, this wasn't some kind of elaborate hobby that would collapse as soon as the YouTube fame wore off. Having Summit Racing as a customer helped convince them we were legitimate, but I still felt like I was defending my sanity every time I had to explain our business model. May handled most of the negotiations, which was good because she could talk to bankers and real estate agents without sounding like she was making the whole thing up as she went along. She had this way of presenting our operation that made it sound both innovative and inevitable, like of course someone would eventually figure out how to turn vintage automotive blueprints into a modern manufacturing business. While we were waiting for the property purchase to finalize, I started working on something I'd been thinking about for months. Using one of Grandpa's ring designs as inspiration, I had Joe cast a custom engagement ring that incorporated a tiny Mustang silhouette into the band. It wasn't traditional, but neither was our entire relationship, and I figured May would appreciate something that honored both our shared automotive obsession and the car that had brought us together. I proposed on a Saturday evening in November, right there in the garage where everything had started. May was wearing coveralls and had grease under her fingernails from helping me install a new workbench, which seemed like the perfect setting for two people whose idea of romance involved carburetors and custom fabrication. When I showed her the ring, with its tiny Mustang silhouette catching the light from the overhead fluorescence, May started crying in a way that made me worried I'd completely misread the situation. But then she said yes while laughing and cry at the same time, and I realized that sometimes the best moments in life happen in the most ordinary places, surrounded by the tools and dreams that define who you really are. We spent that evening sitting on the tailgate of my pickup truck, drinking beer and making plans for a facility we'd build on our new property. May wanted dedicated space for photography and marketing. I wanted a proper machine shop where we could do more of our own fabrication. We both wanted office space that didn't smell like motor oil, though I wasn't entirely convinced that was possible given our line of work. The property purchase finally went through in December, on a cold Tuesday that reminded me why most sensible people spend winter somewhere warmer than Iowa. But standing on our land, looking at the farmhouse that would become our home and the empty fields where we'd build our business, I felt like Grandpa's old philosophy about threads and bolts had finally come full circle. Everything had found its proper place. The blueprints that had seemed worthless, the garage that everyone thought was obsolete, the partnership with someone who understood both the business and the passion behind it. We were building something that honored the past while embracing the future, exactly what Grandpa would have wanted to see. May stood next to me in the December wind, wearing an engagement ring that caught snowflakes like tiny automotive crystals, and I realized that sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is exactly what you need to find everything you never knew you were looking for. We had land, a business, and a future that felt as solid as a perfectly rebuilt engine. The only thing left was to build it all, one custom part at a time. 3 years later, May and I are millionaires. Not from winning the lottery or selling cryptocurrency, but from Grandpa's blueprints that I almost threw away in a moment of desperation. We've got a proper manufacturing facility, a house overlooking a small lake, and a 2-year-old son named Eddie after Grandpa Ed. And we have a dream that's finally coming together, turning that old garage where everything started into something that honors automotive history. The business that started with me living in a trailer has become Midwest Heritage Manufacturing, complete with 53 employees and customers in all 50 states plus 6 countries. We've moved way beyond just reproducing Grandpa's designs. We become the go-to source for anyone trying to restore classic American cars with parts that simply don't exist anywhere else. Our latest product line, Retro American Originals, includes everything from custom keychains to jewelry that incorporates vintage automotive elements. Made jokes that pretty soon we'll be making socks with Chevrolet logos, and honestly, at this point I wouldn't put it past us. If there's a market for automotive-themed anything, we've probably got at least 3 customer requests for it. The breakthrough moment came when the Smithsonian Institution contacted us about purchasing 12 of Grandpa's original blueprints for a permanent exhibit called American Garage Dreams: Innovation in the Age of Muscle Cars. Standing in that museum, looking at Grandpa's hand-drawn carburetor specifications displayed next to artifacts from Ford and General Motors, I could practically hear his voice saying he'd told me those drawings were worth something. That Smithsonian exhibit opened doors we'd never imagined. Suddenly, we were getting calls from automotive museums across the country, restoration shops that catered to serious collectors, even movie studios that needed authentic-looking parts for period films. Our little Iowa operation had somehow become a recognized authority on vintage American automotive hardware. But the project I'm most proud of is what we did with Grandpa's original garage. Instead of letting it sit empty or tearing it down, we turned it into a working museum. We restored everything exactly as it was when Grandpa was alive. His tool chest in the same corner, his coffee mug still sitting on the workbench, even his collection of 8-track tapes with Boston and Foghat still stacked next to the old radio. The Garage Museum draws visitors from all over the Midwest now. Car clubs make pilgrimages to see where it all started, and we give tours to school groups who want to learn about American manufacturing history. Last week, a 10-year-old kid asked me if he could become a mechanic when he grew up, and I told him the same thing Grandpa used to tell me. You can become anything you want, as long as you find your thread and never let go of it. What really gets me is watching older visitors who remember when every town had a garage like Grandpa's. They'll spend an hour just standing there, touching the tools and telling stories about their fathers or grandfathers who worked on cars back when fixing them required actual skill instead of plugging into a computer. We're preserving more than just automotive history. We're keeping alive a way of life that built modern America. The museum also serves as our research and development center. When customers bring us challenges, like reproducing a specific trim piece that hasn't been manufactured since 1968, we can use Grandpa's techniques and tools to prototype solutions before moving to modern manufacturing. It's like having a time machine that connects vintage craftsmanship with contemporary technology. Travis occasionally makes appearances in our story, usually through social media posts where he tries to take credit for inspiring our success. His latest TikTok video was titled, "Here's What I Lost When I Didn't Believe in Family Business," and the comment section was absolutely brutal. People were writing things like, "You made your choice, dude, and maybe try earning something instead of inheriting it." I actually feel a little sorry for Travis now. He's still driving that Lexus and working in Patricia's real estate office, but you can tell he's watching our success with the kind of regret that eats at you from the inside. His social media followers mock him every time he posts about business or success, because everyone knows the story of how he inherited a legacy and traded it for a paycheck. The irony is that Travis could have been part of this if he'd ever shown any interest in actually working. But he wanted ownership without effort, profit without passion, and that's not how real businesses are built. As May likes to say, his likes and shares won't buy him a vintage Pontiac, no matter how many motivational quotes he posts. May and I got married in the Garage Museum, surrounded by all the tools and memories that brought us together. Instead of traditional wedding favors, we gave guests custom keychains made from metal salvage from a 1967 Mustang, each one engraved with a date and Grandpa's favorite saying about finding your thread. It was probably the only wedding in Iowa history where the decorations included carburetor blueprints and the music playlist featured exclusively classic rock. Our son Eddie is already showing signs of mechanical curiosity. At 2 years old, he can identify the difference between a Phillips head and flathead screwdriver, and he insists on helping whenever I'm working on a project. May jokes that he's going to be the first kid in his preschool class to understand gear ratios, and she's probably not wrong. The house we built overlooks the same cornfields where I used to sit in that trailer, wondering if my life was completely over. From our kitchen window, you can see the manufacturing facility where we employ people who build parts that keep classic American cars running all over the world. It's like looking at a dream that somehow became real through a combination of luck, hard work, and refusing to give up on things that other people considered worthless. May and I also completed her father's 1967 Mustang, the one that brought us together in the first place. It took us 8 months and every custom part we could create, but every bolt, every piece of chrome, every detail is exactly as her dad would have wanted it. That car represents everything our business stands for, honoring the past while embracing the future and keeping family dreams alive. Last weekend, I took Eddie out to the garage museum for some father-son time. He was wearing tiny coveralls that May had custom-made with future gearhead embroidered on the pocket, and he was carrying a plastic toolbox that made realistic wrench sounds when you opened it. We sat on the same milk crate where I used to listen to Grandpa's stories, and I tried to explain what all the tools were for. Eddie picked up one of Grandpa's old wrenches, studied it with a serious concentration that only toddlers can manage, and declared that it was for fixing vroom vrooms. He wasn't wrong, and I realized that maybe understanding the purpose is more important than knowing the technical specifications. I told Eddie about his great-grandfather, about how Grandpa Ed had built something important with his hands and his knowledge, about how every tool in that garage represented decades of solving problems and helping people. Eddie nodded like he understood every word, though he was probably just agreeing, so we could go look at the Mustang again. Standing there in that garage, holding my son and surrounded by 3 generations of automotive history, I finally understood what Grandpa meant about threads and bolts. It wasn't just about mechanical connections. It was about finding where you belong in the larger machinery of life, about recognizing that your piece might seem small, but it's essential to making everything else work properly. We walked over to May's father's restored Mustang, and Eddie immediately wanted to sit behind the steering wheel and make engine noises. I lifted him into the driver's seat and told him that someday, when he was older, we'd work on cars together just like I used to work with Grandpa. Eddie just pointed at all the shiny parts and said, "Pretty car, Daddy," in that way that 2-year-olds do when they're genuinely amazed by something. I told him that yes, it was a very pretty car, and that someday he'd understand why cars like this were so special. Not just because they're beautiful, but because they carry stories and memories that connect us to the people we love. Eddie nodded seriously, then asked if he could start the engine and make it go vroom really loud. I laughed and turned the key, and that 289 V8 roared to life, like it was singing the national anthem of American automotive engineering. Eddie clapped his hands and giggled, and I realized that some traditions are worth preserving not because they're old, but because they're timeless. Sitting there with Eddie and Grandpa's Mustang, listening to that perfectly tuned engine idle like mechanical poetry, I thought about how far we'd all come. From a dusty box of blueprints to a multi-million-dollar business. From a broken inheritance to a restored legacy. From a guy living in a trailer to a father teaching his son about the tools that built America. Grandpa was right about everything. Every nut does have its thread. Every bolt does have its home, and sometimes the most valuable things are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone who understands their worth. The engine settled into a perfect rhythm, and I knew that whatever came next, we'd built something that would last long after Eddie has kids of his own to teach about finding their place in the world.